Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. Joined with me, as always, is Joe Meade. And today, Joe and I will be finishing our Big Ten basketball power rankings. This is version 2. We did one before the season, and this is part 2 of this video. So if you have not checked out part 1, please go back and watch that first, as we've done the first half of the power rankings already. But, Joe, let's officially get into it. On the board, those are the 9 teams that we did in the previous video. Still a lot of spots to go. We are going in reverse alphabetical order because we did alphabetical order in the first season. And, Joe, that means we left off with Northwestern. A lot of question marks around the Wildcats coming into the season with Boo Buie, probably one of the best players in their program's history, leaving the team. And with Brooks Barnheiser, Nick Martinelli, Ty Berry, and Matthew Nicholson coming back, and transfer Jalen Leach joining the fold, expectations were, I would say, in a medium spot. They come in with a tough loss early on in the year to Dayton, a tough loss to Butler in Arizona in their MTE, and then a really tough loss on the road at Carver Hawkeye Arena on a Josh Dix fall-away 3, which resulted in a 1-point Iowa victory. But, Joe, they did turn it around by beating ranked Illinois at home in overtime in their last game. Joe, what are your thoughts on Northwestern so far this year?
Sean, I think the medium expectations were kind of underselling this team, especially with the context that Brooks Barnheiser would make a return like he has. They really should be 2-0 in Big Ten play. I think Nick Martinelli is probably the surprise of the year in the conference, or at least got to be top 5 in terms of players. Jalen Leach, the ex-Fairfield Stag, I thought he's been phenomenal. I think adding him's kind of been an underrated acquisition. I do think they need more from Ty Berry. Matt Nicholson, I think, needs to produce a little more too, even on the rebounding side. I think averaging 5 rebounds a game for him. He needs to do a lot better than that. Where I placed Northwestern, I placed them in 8th place, Sean, which is comfortably in the tournament. Had they won that Iowa game, I'm probably not hard-pressed to say that me or you wouldn't rate them even higher in this list. I think the Dayton loss was unfortunate. I also do think that that the Butler loss is one they're going to really want back at the end of the year. But as of now, Sean, they're in a good spot to make the tournament, especially after that Illinois win. One that, let's face it, Sean, they played really well and probably shouldn't have had any business having that even be that close, in my opinion. Those are games at Welsh Ryan they should typically blow teams out in or not even have it go to overtime. But give me the Wildcats in 8th place, Sean.
Yeah, Joe, they've been in a pretty good position to win all their games this year. And, there were some that they did win, like that Eastern Illinois game went to overtime, but they were in a good position against Dayton. Sort of gave that one away late. They were in a good position against Butler, lost that. And then, like you said, they really should have won the Iowa game. So I think I'm not really changing my mind a whole lot about Northwestern. I think they have 3 really good players. Martinelli's averaging over 20 a game, then Barnheiser's just under 20, and Leach is at 14.3. But after that, Ty Berry's in 4th at 6.9, and then you're under 5 to go from that. So I think depth is a big issue for Northwestern. And unfortunately, as we go through the Big Ten season here, Joe, I think they're just going to come up against teams that are a little deeper than them. And I have them in 11th. I haven't really changed my mind on them a whole lot. They're really good defensively. They're the first team that really made Illinois suffer on the offensive end. And I think they're right there on the bubble for me. And their analytics are always going to grade out well because they always get those big wins. But it'll be interesting to see, can they win some of their games here by a lot. They play Georgia Tech in Milwaukee, DePaul at home, and the Northeastern at home. Can you win? Can you cover those spreads by a lot? Can you boost your metrics a little bit here? Because a lot of those early bye games were close. You had a 9-point win over UIC, overtime against Eastern Illinois, 3 points over Montana State. Joe, I think you need a couple, push those metrics back up and get them in a good spot for the tournament. But I think they're right there on the bubble right now. And that Illinois win really does change a lot. I think I have them out if they don't pull that one off, but they do. And we'll see if they can get a little more from their bench. KJ Wyndham has been pretty good as a freshman, but We haven't seen him the last couple games with an injury, so hopefully he can come back soon. But, Joe, I think we were kind of right on Northwestern, and I don't think that's the worst thing because they were picked pretty low in the coaches' poll, as we've mentioned a couple of times here. All right, Joe, going up the ladder here, Nebraska, Fred Hoiberg. Lost a lot of talent off that team last year that made the NCAA tournament. They didn't look great early, a couple bye games that were closer than they should have been, a loss on the road at St. Mary's, but then it all changed on November 22nd when they went on the road and punked their in-state rivals Creighton it ended up being 11, but it was much, much more lopsided than that. And then since then, a very, very humbling 37-point loss to Michigan State on the road. Their second Big Ten game is up. It'll be later today by the time you see this video against Indiana. But, Joe, mixed bag for Nebraska here. What are your thoughts on the Cornhuskers so far?
I do think you could take away some positives, particularly that win over Creighton. Even to an extent, the loss to St. Mary's, that's not going to be a bad loss come March, should they be in that conversation, which, based on where I rank them, might not be the craziest conversation to have. I think their upcoming game, depending on when you're listening to this, against Indiana tomorrow night on Friday is huge for their hopes and their hopes in the conference as well. I think Connor Essegian's been a pretty decent addition to the team. I think he's done really well. I'd like to see him score even more and play even more games, play even more minutes in games. Bryce Williams has been phenomenal, but I think this is a theme we're seeing a lot. They have guys that can contribute, but no one who can really step up quite yet. I think that's going to be on Jawan Gary to a heavy extent, based on the other supporting cast I don't have as much confidence in. With that said, Sean, Nebraska, give me them in 14th.
I've got them in the same spot, Joe. I think they're just they're just not as talented as they were last year. And I think we're going to find out whether Hoiberg can get them across the line in a couple of their home games against teams that are slightly better than them. I think tomorrow will be a big one. They got smoked on the road at Michigan State. They're at home against a team that hasn't played a road game yet. Can they beat Indiana and sort of put themselves back in the conversation here in the Big Ten? Or are they going to lose it and really fall behind the 8 ball as they try and make it 2 years in a row in the tournament? But, Joe, that game will be a big one, and I think it will be for the other team here, too. Up next, we've got Minnesota. Not a great start for Ben Johnson and the Golden Gophers, but not really unexpected. They are 6-5 on the year. A loss to North Texas at home, losses to Wichita State and Wake Forest in the ESPN Events Invitational, and then 2 losses to start off Big Ten play against Michigan State and Indiana. Joe, Dawson Garcia is a really good player, probably headed towards another first-team all-conference selection. But other than that, there's not much there for Ben Johnson and the Golden Gophers. Unfortunately, more losses are ahead for Minnesota.
Yeah, Sean, simple as that. Starting off 0-2 in the conference is never a good omen, especially when you couple it with losses, albeit Wake and Wichita were close games. The North Texas one was very unfortunate. They really could have lost to Yale and Central Michigan as well, both home games. Nothing really indicates to me Minnesota's going to be much of a threat. The only reason I have them one spot above Washington in 17th is because of guys like Dawson Garcia. Even Mike Mitchell Jr. to an extent could score in spurts. I think they could pick off 1 or 2 teams because of those 2 guys going crazy and the other team having a freezing cold kind of night on the offensive side of the ball, because that's the only way Minnesota's going to win games, just praying other teams don't shoot as well at the barn. So Minnesota's 17th place. Not much else to say after that.
Yep, same for me, Joe. I think they're a mid-major team with Dawson Garcia. And unfortunately, they're just going to be outclassed in a lot of these Big Ten games. Maybe they catch a team on a bad night and make a couple shots at home. But, Joe, they just took 11 threes against Indiana, and this was a game where they were behind pretty much from the first minute. And that, that's not how you come back. And yeah, I think I'll be surprised if they win a road game, and then at home, I think they're probably gonna lose more than they win at home, and that's unfortunate for them. All right, up next, Joe, we've got your Michigan Wolverines. Quite the season so far, 8-2 overall. A tough loss in a semi-road game against Wake. You beat TCU. You win the Fort Myers tip-off with big victories against Virginia Tech and Xavier. You go on the road and win at the Kohl Center. You hold off a late Iowa comeback at home. And then what was one of the greatest games in college basketball regular season history, you unfortunately fall to Arkansas 89-87. But overall, a pretty good season for your Michigan Wolverines, Joe, and certainly will be higher than we had them in the preseason.
Yeah, Sean, I think outside of the Wake Forest loss, there's really no huge blemish on this season. I do think the Xavier win will be a quad one win eventually. I think they'll finish 1-50. So in terms of resume, theirs is right up there. And the Arkansas loss, based on how they've started to click, is not going to look so bad after all. So really impressed with Michigan. I think the weaknesses, as we've discussed a lot, is the turnovers. Some of the defensive rebounding needs to be sharpened up as well. But I think the turnovers is the biggest kryptonite of this team. The fact that it hasn't gotten corrected almost 2 months into the season's a bit troubling for me. They have plenty of opportunities to pick up better wins too, particularly next week against Oklahoma, who I believe is still undefeated. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, and
Yes,
ranked
they
in
are.
the top 15. So should they win that game, I think it nullifies both the Arkansas and Wake Forest loss to the non-conference. And let's face it, Sean, that Xavier victory is a lot more than most Big Ten teams are going to do in the non-con, barring a terrible loss to Purdue, Fort Wayne, or Western Kentucky. I think this team can beat you in a lot of different ways. Particularly, it's been Area 51 of late, Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden. I think Wolf needs to stop turning the ball over because then he could really be a Big Ten Player of the Year type player. Michigan needs more from their guards. That's why ultimately I'm going to put them in sixth. I think being top third of the conference at this rate is really good. Being 2-0 in the conference is outstanding, especially after a trip to the Kohl Center. So by no means is that a reflection that Michigan's been disappointing in any way. I think the fact that they're considered in the top third of this conference in year one at Dusty May while playing these tough games, 8-2, probably going to make the tournament. It's really hard to criticize much besides the turnovers.
Yeah, I've been very impressed with Dusty this year. I think he's done an excellent job in-game coaching. I think they still have a couple of flaws offensively, or not offensively, sorry, just in general. And I think he's found a way around that for the most part. You know, you're a couple plays away from not having a loss. And I know it's easy to say that, but Arkansas played awesome in that game. They had their guards rolling, and you still turned it over 17 times, missed 7 free throws, and lost by 2, and had a chance to tie it on the last possession. Like, I think when Michigan plays bad, it's a close game, and when they play well, they win by a lot. And you'd have to think that at least half the time you're going to play well. So there you go. There's half your wins. And then if you can win a third of the games where you don't play well in, I mean, we're looking at a top 3 finish here, Joe. I'm just a little bit higher on them than you are. I've got them in 5th, but, you know, they have some a serious issue in turnovers, Joe. They're turning it over a ton, and they're still pretty efficient on offense and obviously really efficient on defense. Those numbers don't look as great as they did before the Arkansas game, but Arkansas will be a good team in a loaded SEC. I just think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity there to pick up a big win because you were winning by a lot, then you were losing by a lot, and then you came back. But I think that shows Dusty May's in-game adjustments. There were a ton of stuff, if you go back and watch the film there, that he did differently. Arkansas went from going downhill and scoring every possession to not 5 or 6 possessions in a row without scoring, which allowed Michigan to get back in the game. But I am excited for Michigan, Joe. I think that Oklahoma game is really big. I think to stamp this non-conference season, I think you should win that Oklahoma game. They haven't played anybody in the tournament as of yet. You're in a North Carolina. Not really sure if there's a fan lean there. Maybe Michigan gets down there, but I would think Michigan is probably going to be favored here, Joe, and I think they do get the job done. But, you know, stamp the approval on this good non-conference season by beating Oklahoma, and I think you're headed towards a double bye in the tournament. All right, up next, Joe, we've got your neighbors to the west, the Michigan State Spartans out of East Lansing. We both predicted them in 4th, and it's been a pretty good season overall for the Spartans. They're 8-2 overall and 2-0 in the Big Ten. A close loss to Kansas to start off the year in the Champions Classic. A 2-1 trip to Maui with wins over Colorado and North Carolina, and a loss to Memphis. And then a big win on the road at Minnesota and a big win at home to Nebraska. Things seem like they're starting to come together for Michigan State.
Yeah, Sean, I think that's why I'm really high on them. I think they've really figured it out. This is something they've had to do into January and February in most years. The fact they've done it in late November, early December is a really good sign. I think Maui's going to be the turning point of their season, not like it was really falling off the rails. They only lost to Kansas and Memphis, who shot the lights out against them. And that was a game Michigan State came back into. They were down a lot, and we don't need to go into length about that. I know they've only beaten Minnesota and Nebraska in conference, but those are games they've won by a lot. They've really slammed the door early and not let the other team back in. That's a really good sign. Michigan State last year got in trouble because they played around in games like that and ultimately lost a lot of them. So I think this is a huge improvement, even though some of the experienced talent, the Tyson Walkers, AJ Hogarts of the world are gone. I think they figured it out with Trey Holloman going in there a lot to give rest to guys. I think Jace Richardson's been one of the better freshmen in the country for Michigan State. And then you have Jaden Akins, the leader of that team. I think Fiddler is going to get going. I think he is what he is. He's an 8 to 10 points a game kind of guy, but perhaps he could pop off eventually. Xavier Booker's been impressive. I think they've kind of calmed him down, told him he doesn't have to be Superman. I think the role he's playing right now is really sustainable, something he could even improve at throughout the year. Uh, that's why I have Michigan State shot in second place in my power rankings. I think they've been outstanding. Sure, they might lack the signature win as North Carolina's kind of faltered, but I do think I'll put it to you this way. If they played Kansas in the Champions Classic, if the Champions Classic was December 14th instead of early November, I'd actually pick Michigan State to win that game.
Yeah, so Joe, you got UCLA and then Oregon. So third place is open.
Third place, Michigan State.
So I have got them in second place. I've been really impressed with them. And like you said when you went through the personnel, I do think that they could get some better individual performances. Not that they need it right now, but they were pretty close against a good Kansas team. They won 2 games in Maui, and they rolled over two of the teams that are going to finish near the bottom here in the Big Ten. I think they are going to headed towards the top of the league finish. We talked about them maybe not having the ceiling that some of these other good teams do, but they might have the highest floor in the conference, just from a consistency point of view. Their defense always brings it. And Joe, looking at their schedule, they seem to play most of the good teams at home, and I think they're going to be leading the Big Ten when we do this next, whether that's middle of January or later in January. I think they will be leading the league then. So I've got them in second. I've been impressed with them so far, and it feels like Izzo is sort of grown a little bit as a coach over the last couple of years. Like, they could have brought Hogard back. They didn't. And he's starting to give a couple of these players opportunities, and they're all showing that they're getting better as the season goes along, and we're not even to the halfway point yet. So I've been impressed with Michigan State so far. I don't know if a national championship is on the cards for them, but certainly second weekend looks attainable at this point. All right, Joe, we're going to go to College Park, Maryland. The Terrapins 8-2 overall and 1-1. A pretty new roster for Kevin Willard. Julian Reese is back, but all of a sudden, Joe, he's the 4th leading scorer on this team. Derek Queen, 5-star freshman, 17.5, and 8.5. Jacoby Gillespie, the Belmont transfer, 15 points per game. And then sophomore Rodney Rice, who played a limited role on the bench at Virginia Tech last year. But Joe, Kevin Willard seems to have addressed the issues in his team last year, and they look pretty good. A tough home loss to Marquette and a tough loss on the road at Purdue. Other than that, they've won, a number of games against okay opposition, some big wins against bad opposition, the big win against Ohio State. But overall, it has to be stock up, or at least stock even from the beginning of the year for Maryland.
I think it's been a great year. I think even the, I look at some of these games. Even the Villanova game, to an extent, was a bit disappointing how they could really blow them out. But other than that, really the demolition of Ohio State in that first half really influenced my opinion on Maryland a lot. And the fact they went to Mackey, they were competitive that entire game.
They were winning for 3/4 of that game.
Yeah. I think a few shots, and I'd hate to be this guy. A few calls go their way, and they're out of there 2-0 in the conference with an even more impressive when then at the Kohl Center or at Oregon, like UCLA or Michigan had. So, uh, Kevin Willard, I know we say this a lot with him, and maybe we're a little apologist for him because he wasn't Seton Hall in our home state for so long. He's probably done one of the more impressive jobs along with Mike Rhodes in this conference so far, Sean, in terms of the expectation and the fact that he had guys like Julian Reese who were the former leaders of the team in scoring, and now he's allowed them to make way for some of these newcomers, and particularly a freshman in Derek Queen. So I Maryland in seventh, Sean. That's certainly in the tournament, and I think they could be a top 25 team if they keep playing like this. If they
Yeah, I agree, Joe. I think they've been the roster concerns that they had last year between really a lack of solid players, it's gone. I mean, they have 7 good players, and that is really all that Kevin Willard needs. They are good defensively. That's never really not been the case. They're up in 11th, and then people were wondering whether the too big look would work. They're 36th in offensive efficiency, and I think they're capable of making more shots, Joe. I have them in 6th. I think you got to like where you're at right now. You're top 20 in Ken Palm. They're running a little bit more tempo than they usually do. I think Kevin Willard is approaching this year a little different than he did last year at Maryland, and so far, so good. All right, Joe, into the I teams now. We've got 3 left. The Iowa Hawkeyes, who are in action right now as we're recording, so we're going to pretend like this game hasn't happened yet. They are winning at halftime against Iowa State. That would be a big win, but let's pretend like this game hasn't happened yet. The Hawkeyes, as this loads for a second, the Hawkeyes have been all right this year. I do know that off the top of my head. They're 7-2, 1-1. They did pick up a win against Washington State on a neutral, a tough loss to Utah State at the Hall of Fame Classic, and then that victory against Northwestern, like we said, a very close, tough loss where they came from behind at the Chrysler Center, and then this game against Iowa State, Joe. But where do you have Iowa so far as Fran McCaffrey's back with another team that scores a lot and gives up a lot?
God, I have them at 13th. I think a lot of people are going to rage at how low I have them. And by no means, again, that's very still much in this conference, a team that can make the tournament. I think as of now, based on what Sean, I still have you. My bad. I cut out for a sec.
Yep.
But based on what they've done so far, I don't think they've earned it yet. Perhaps an Iowa State victory or even a win against a team like Utah could do wonders for them. I just think they lack the marquee non-conference win. I think that Utah State loss hurts them to a heavy extent as well. Outside of that, Sean, typical Fran McCaffrey team. Peyton Sanford's great. I think his brother's not bad either. Josh Dix, Owen Freeman. They have guys that can score. They have guys that can produce. Can they do it consistently? And can their 2-point defense get even better? I think that's what's going to come down to. I'm inclined to believe their 2-point defense won't get better, but they're going to score and win a lot of games by doing that. So Iowa 13th for me.
Yep, I've got them in the same spot, Joe. Now, if they were to win tonight, that probably bumps them up 4 or 5 spots because Iowa State is awesome. They're ranked 3rd in the country, but they shoot field goals at a high percentage. They make threes. It doesn't really matter who's on their team every year. I mean, yes, when they had a National Player of the Year candidate in Luka Garza, they were really good, but they've always been good offensively. They do struggle at the rim, so we're seeing a lot more pressure defense from Iowa trying to turn you over rather than miss a shot. But I have them in 13th too right now, still an incomplete. This is really their first elite team that they've played, and 20 minutes down, and they're looking pretty good in it. But it hasn't happened yet because we've been recording videos when we made our lists, and you'll just have to tune into the January one to see where we think Iowa should be next. All right, Joe, 2 teams left. Now we got the Indiana Hoosiers, a very up and down season so far for the Crimson and Cream. 8-2, they're 7-0 in the United States. 1-2 down in the battle for Atlantis, but a big victory against South Carolina, big losses to Louisville and Gonzaga, and a big win to Providence down there in Atlantis, and then to covering by-game wins and a 15-point win over Minnesota since then. So, Joe, thoughts on where Indiana is so far?
John, Indiana's a team that makes very little sense to me. This roster is phenomenal. I mean, geez, I think there's a lot of coaches who could do better with this roster. I don't think that's really stepping in any unwanted places. But the performance of the Battle for Atlantis in those two games are really hard to unsee. I think the performance in the bye games have gotten a little better, but ultimately, I think the ceiling of this team hasn't even been reached yet. I think based on the way they've been playing, it's not going to be reached in the month of December. That's why I have Indiana middle of the pack. They've been playing like one, Sean. I think you exclude the preseason expectations, and they're just a typical solid team. That's not to say they're bad. At 10 would get them into the tournament if they were 10th place in this conference. But it's not a team that screams to me they'll get the double bye or frankly be playing ranked as a top 25 team like they were the early part of this year.
Yeah, I've got them 2 spots higher in 8th, Joe. I just don't really know. It really is going to come down to, was that team, the Battle for Atlantis, the real Indiana, or was that some fluky MTE stuff? And we've seen both of those be the case so far. North Carolina looks bad in Maui. Turns out they're not a good team. And we have teams like Houston look bad in Vegas. They go 1-2, and turns out they're still probably a top 15 team. So, this Indiana team still did beat Tennessee on the road in an exhibition with fans. Tennessee's ranked number 1 in the country, by the way. But defensively, I think there's still a couple issues that have sort of gotten better since Atlantis. And then on the offensive end, Joe, this Indiana team's a little bit more efficient than I expected them to be. They're in the top 20 in offensive efficiency. They're shooting 2s and 3s at a high clip. There are games that they have turned it over a little bit too much, but I still think this is another incomplete grade, Joe. They started the year 39th in KenPom. They're 40th now, so essentially playing to what they've expected. And we're looking at a team that, the South Carolina is a team that they should probably be beating at home. They did. Minnesota, a team that you probably should be beating at home. They did. So that's why I said that Nebraska game tomorrow is going to be big. Can they go on the road and beat a team that they are better than? If they do, well, maybe a double bye is back on the table. If they don't, I think we're headed towards a 9, 10, or 11 win season and probably a 9 or 10 seed in the NCAA tournament. But I still think the range of outcomes is pretty wide for Indiana. They are better than last year. They're starting to really play a lot of one big on the floor, which didn't happen at all last year. And the plus minuses in every game since Atlantis I've tracked, they're about even with 2 bigs on the floor and usually around the margin of the victory with 1 big. They're +1 against Minnesota with 2 bigs, +14 with 1. So can they use the 1 big system effectively against the rest of the Big Ten? That'll be the question. So, Joe, 1 team remaining. Illinois. You have got your 5th spot open, and I have got my 1st spot open. The Fighting Illini have an incredibly talented roster coming into the year with a lot of questions. And so far, it's been pretty good for Illinois. This might be a little bit of a potential play for me because I don't think we've seen the best of what Illinois has had to offer. That loss against Northwestern was a little bit concerning, but that's the first time that their offense has really looked poor all year. And they had a huge win early on in the year against Arkansas on Thanksgiving on a neutral, and the only time that they really looked outmatched was against Alabama when they lost by 13 on a semi-road game. They've been scoring it at a good clip. They did beat Wisconsin since that Northwestern loss. But, Joe, I think this Illinois team is going to be a problem for people to guard. And when they have a bunch of good players that don't all need to play well for them to win games. And I think there's a lot of teams that we could argue to be top 4 in this league, but I don't know if there's a definite number 1 yet. So I think the different play style might get the edge here.
Yeah, Sean, I have Illinois at 5th. And again, I think they're really impressive. I do like the potential play for you. I don't really put it as high. That doesn't mean their ceiling's not high. I think they have one of the higher ones in the country, let alone the conference. It's the fact they still were led by three young guys. Winston
Yep.
Kotis, Avicic, Will Riley, and they've all been outstanding. They've all definitely lived up to expectations and exceeded them. That was found out very early on in the year, particularly in the Arkansas game. Where I have an issue is I think that's going to show up in some road games. Not that Brad Underwood's not going to have them prepared. It's just you could only take preparation to a certain extent, right, Sean? I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many examples in college basketball throughout the year. There are so many times where Purdue's been the most talented team, or Duke's been the most talented team, UNC, whoever, and due to the heavy influx of freshmen they'll have, or Kentucky, they'll lose a lot of road games. It happens. And I think that's going to be a lot of Illinois' losses this year. It's not necessarily they're outclassed or that the other team's better. It's just the freshman factor to an extent. So Illinois' fifth place. I think they've had a really impressive resume so far. I think the Northwestern game, the fact they were in that game competitively, definitely not playing their best ball, is a really good sign. I think they do a lot of things right, and I'm led to believe with these freshmen, I won't be. This will be the lowest I'll probably place Illinois all year. I think they'll get better. I think they're going to lose a few dumb games, but I don't think it's going to distract from the fact that this is going to be a team in March no one's going to want to see.
Yeah, Joe, I really thought about my top 5 teams for the number 1 spot. And I think had Michigan beat Arkansas, I think I might have put them there. But I think the top 5 is definitely a little separating themselves just a little bit with a couple big wins so far, whether it's a non-con victory or the road win for UCLA against Oregon. But all those top 5 teams, I think, have really given themselves a legit shot at a top 4 protected seed if they can go out and, win 13, 14 games here in the Big Ten. But Illinois, I think, where Illinois is the only team in the league where I think if they play well, they're going to win, if that makes sense. I think there are some other teams that might be able to not win when they play their best. I think if Illinois play their best, they're going to win. And certainly the Northwestern game they struggled in, but they still got it to overtime. And they were 33% from the field or something like that. So Illinois is my pick to win the league right now. Obviously, I've had 3 different picks to win this league, and the 3 times that we've done it, whether it was Purdue in the beginning of the year, Indiana before the season, now Illinois. But, Joe, this conference overall, I think, is in a good spot. It's been a pretty decent non-conference. There's a ton of high-profile games until the conference play resumes. Illinois, tomorrow, by the time you're watching this, will be hosting number 1 Tennessee. If they win that, my prediction looks a whole lot better. If they don't, well, maybe not. But, Joe, overall, I think this conference is in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, Sean, I think outside of the 2 teams we mentioned, or maybe 3 if you include USC, all these teams have a case to make the tournament. That's not necessarily meaning all of them have had the wins yet. For a team like Rutgers, they have the ceiling to do it. Nebraska, they have the win against Creighton. I don't think their ceiling's that high. But there's been strides that have been made to an extent, right? I can't rule 15 of the 18 teams out, which is a really good sign come December. And I do think there's going to be a lot of quad 1 wins in this conference, and at worst a quad 2. So I think that's outstanding for a lot of teams to get into the tournament of the 18. Right now, if I had to put a number on it, I'd probably say 10 or 11 get in, to be quite honest. I think the strength of the league is the highest it's been, obviously with the 18 teams. That's an easy statement to make. But, Sean, if you had to put a number out there on the spot, what would it be?
I think 11. 11 is what I'm looking at right here,
Yeah.
Joe. Now, I think that would entail sort of a number of teams beating up on each other and maybe like the best Big Ten team being a 4 seed or something like that. I think we're going to see it in the SEC too. There's so many good teams in that league where like a 500 team in conference play might be like a 4 or 5 seed just from a number of good wins and a terribly difficult schedule. But if you look at the analytics, we'll end this here, Joe. Illinois is the highest ranked team in Ken Pom at 15. 16th UCLA, 17th Purdue, 19th Maryland, 21st Oregon, 22nd Michigan State, 24th Michigan, 29th Ohio State, 33rd Penn State, 35th Wisconsin, 39th Indiana. That is a lot. I didn't count. But we've got 10 or 11 teams, is that, in the top 40 in Ken Pom, and that is pretty much, if you're in the top 40, you're probably going to get an at-large bid. Now, we saw some weird things last year with St. John's being 27th or something and not getting in. that was a high bid stealer year. I think if you're in the top 40 in Ken Palm, you're going to be feeling good about your at-large chances, and the numbers are pointing to that being the case so far. So be sure to check out those analytics as they come in. It's looking like they like the Big Ten so far, and it's hard for that to change if the Big Ten only plays the Big Ten. So I think our conference is in a good spot, Joe, and we're going to wrap up version 2 of our basketball power rankings. Be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. We're going to have a ton of bowl previews coming up, some season recaps of the football teams that have already stopped, and then, of course, an end-of-season football power rankings, and then it's all basketball from there until the NCAA tournament. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.